Wow, this is a hot one. Welcome back to Hardball. Elections are always about getting your voters out to the polls to vote for your candidate. But Republican-controlled legislatures across the country and the states from coast to coast are pushing efforts now to rewrite election laws themselves in order to restrict access to the voting booth. You get it? More than 30 states this year alone debated changes to their voting laws, according to the Washington Post. And this is it. In 12 states, legislators passed laws now that either created photo ID laws or made existing laws stricter. In some states, the governor vetoed the legislation, but not all. At least 5 states passed laws limiting early voting. 3 states made it more difficult for ex-felons to vote, and 2 states, Texas and Florida, placed restrictions on voter registration groups. And they were all literally rewriting the rules of the game in an effort to prevent, let's face it, Democrats from getting the polls, minorities, poor people, and younger people in particular. Cynthia Tucker is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist now with the University of Georgia. And Judith Brown-Dianis is the co-director of the Advancement Project. Judith, thank you for joining us. And as always, Cynthia, my colleague. Let me ask you, this is such obvious gamesmanship. I mean, when you start saying, if you do have some voter irregularities somewhere, you fix them, you catch them, you prosecute. But there is no real examples out there floating around of cheating.
None.
So why have they changed the rules to you have to, an older person, 80 years old, who obviously doesn't drive a frickin' car, obviously doesn't have a driver's license, has to go find some sort of document? Where would an 80-year-old person go to get a voting piece of paper that's with a government picture on them? How would they do that even?
Well, in some cases, they have to go to the county seat. If they don't drive, they have to find a ride to get to the county seat.
And somebody has to tell them how to do it.
Exactly.
And they don't know this until they get to the voting booth.
And let me just be very clear about this part, Chris. I come from a rural part of Alabama. I know many little old church ladies who fully participate in society, who have never driven a car and never been on a plane. It is not true that you are marginal just because you don't have a driver's license.
Sure.
Furthermore, they've lived in the same place for the last 80 years.
Let me tell you about city people. They don't all drive cars either. You know?
So when they go to the polls, the poll watchers know who they are. How are you today, Miss Susie?
Right.
They don't need voter ID, but this is the Republicans' way of trying to construct barriers so those little old ladies can't vote.
There's a name for this: voter suppression.
That's right.
Sometimes suspected it back in 2000 in Florida. Hint, hint.
That's right.
About that election.
I remember that.
Okay, let's talk about it now. Here we go into 212, what could be a close election. We don't know.
That's
But
right.
if it's a close election, this stuff matters. Tell us about what's going on.
That's right. We have not only the voter identification laws, but we also have rollbacks on early voting. In Florida, for example, African Americans are twice as likely as whites to vote early.
Why is that? Why is that social pattern operate?
Well, I mean, early voting is
Explain it.
important because it's convenient. You don't have to wait until Tuesday. You can vote on a Saturday. In fact, the Sunday before Election Day, there are drives by the churches to get out the vote because the polls are open the Sunday before the election. But the Florida legislature...
But where do you go to vote, by the way?
You go and vote down at the county seat.
That's what I've
at
done.
the election.
I've done it when I have to leave town for
and
work.
So,
yeah.
and what happened was this year they cut that back, and they specifically cut out that last Sunday before the Election Day because they know who it's going to impact. The people who turned out more than the people who turned out more in 2008.
This is so obvious. By the way, here's Senator Lindsey Graham, a guy who I respect on a number of issues, at a hearing last week praising the new law passed in his state, South Carolina, that requires voters to show a government-issue ID card with a photo on it. More than 178,000 registered voters in that state alone do not have that kind of identification card. Let's listen to Graham, Senator Graham.
I think what South Carolina did makes eminent sense to me. And the law of the land, as I understand it, is the Indiana system's been upheld, and you will see more of this, Mr. Chairman, not less. 30 states have some form of voter ID requirement, so I think this is the future of the country, something we should embrace at the federal level because elections do matter.
Where you sit is where you stand. His votes
Absolutely.
are probably overwhelmingly white, probably overwhelmingly middle
it.
class, and they have ID cards because they got cars. Anyway, after this week's Republican debate, Herman Cain was asked by a reporter what he thought of Senator Graham's proposal for a federal law requiring voters to show a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. He said he'd support it. Let's listen.
If you need a license to get a picture to get on an airplane, why shouldn't you need one in order to be able to vote?
Well, you want to respond to that?
Well, flying on an airplane isn't in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution does not guarantee our right to fly. It does, however, guarantee our right to vote. And let me just say again, Republicans love to say that a photo ID is required for modern life. You're going to get on an airplane. But I know lots of voters who don't fly. And so the comparison simply doesn't hold water.
But I can live a whole life in a big city. I can take the subway. I can go to my ATM machine. I can go to work. I can go to church. I can go to movies. I never need a photo ID.
Right. And it's a myth. Actually, TSA will allow you on a plane without a photo identification if you have other pieces of ID. This is about whether or not
we're going to spend a half hour talking to them.
Right. You can talk to them. Right. And but you can get on a plane. So this is about why do we have to restrict it to this one
Don't
piece
tell
of
people, by the way, that because they'll show it without.
Right.
But let's talk about all these. Let's talk about the politics of this thing, not the techniques. This stuff. What is going on here, and how? What do the Democrats in these state legislatures do when they see this being passed by them? Don't they raise red flags?
Well, they raise red flags, but these are mostly in the states where Republicans took over the state legislatures, and so they can't do anything to slow these things down. I mean, this is like poker. It's really, stacking the deck. I mean, we're going to see a different game.
Let me go home to the state I grew up in, Pennsylvania. They're now talking up to other Republicans about getting rid of the effectively blocked voting of the Electoral College, the unit rule, which is that everybody fights for Pennsylvania. Democrats usually get it, not always. Reagan got it. But here we go. Why are they trying to break up the Electoral College so it's not going to be by congressional district rather than by state?
Because Obama might win Pennsylvania. And if he gets the most votes in Pennsylvania, he gets all the Electoral College votes. That's the way it has worked in most
23, I think,
in most of the states forever.
Right.
But you have to give Republicans credit for this much. They're all about power. They're all about getting elected. And any advantage they can get to turn an election in their favor, they're willing to go for. So destroying the Electoral College system, that's fine with them.
This reminds me of Tom DeLay having a new redistricting halfway through the decade.
Exactly.
Remember that little game he had?
Yep.
What about this breaking up the Electoral College vote? First of all, it destroys the power of the small states that tend to be Republican. So this could be counterproductive, right?
Well,
it's going to kill the power of
we'll see.
South Dakota.
Except for the fact that, that in states where they took over the state legislature, we'll have to see what the outcome is. I mean, if you move to this new system and you've taken over the state legislature and you redistricted yourself into power, then you're always going to get the vote.
Bill Clinton joined us. He told a group of liberal youth activists that Republican governors and legislatures around the country were trying to limit people from being able to vote. Let's watch the pro. Here he is, Bill Clinton.
There has never been in my lifetime, since we got rid of the poll tax and all the other Jim Crow burdens on voting, the determined effort to limit the franchise that we see today.
Well, he was comparing this to the worst of the stuff.
Well, and let me just say that many activists have made that same comparison, and it doesn't apply broadly. I will have no problem voting because I have a driver's license. But they will try to shave off enough votes of elderly folks, poor folks, young voters to affect close races. And a lot of these races are going to be close, Chris.
Look at this. 25% of African voters do not have valid government-issued photo IDs compared to 8% of whites who don't have this. They have a tilt right there. 15% of voters earning less than $35,000 a year don't have photo IDs. So it's almost perfect, isn't it? That's the way to skim Democratic votes.
Why don't Republicans just campaign for the votes of African Americans and Latinos and poor people? Why don't they just go out there with some policies that would appeal to African Americans and Latinos and poor people instead of trying to restrict their access to the ballot box?
Are you being sincere here? I know you are, even though you know why they won't, because it's too much work to make the case. Anyway, it's great having you on. But this is the kind of thing voters, I think, in both parties have got to look seriously at, because you start playing these kind of games. Both parties start playing this kind of game, and we don't have a fair system. Thank you.